Good morning. It is wonderful to wake up to see that there is some spring showers this morning. We need the water for the land. And today I'm always honored to stand before the Wasatch Church to be able to share with you the Word of God, especially today, because this is my last Sabbath with Wasatch Church, and it's honestly a big privilege that the Wasatch Church has given me to be able to share one last time the message of God. It is a bittersweet moment because we feel very sad, but it also brings joy to my heart, the fact that we feel this sad, because it means that our Wasatch community has opened their hearts and it has embraced us as a family, me and my husband, and for that, I really want to thank every one of you. It was the early 1980s. At least this is how it was narrated by Sonia, which was not her real name, but it was a name given to her by the court, so she wasn't recognized. She was telling her story as an 82-year-old Indigenous woman. She remembers that when she woke up that day in her early 20s, it was a day like any other day. The men head out to the fields. Whoever was going to go to the fields, the women head out again. This was happening in the highlands of Guatemala, a small indigenous community found in Nibach. She said it was around 9 in the morning when, for the first time, they saw a helicopter flying very low to the mountains. And they didn't know what was going to happen. But what was occurring inside of the helicopter was that the person that was responsible said, if you see any of the indigenous people running away from the helicopter, it means they're guilty and they're plotting against the Guatemalan government, and you are allowed to execute. The people that did not get executed during that, the army later came in, rounded up all the men, and executed them in the town square. The only thing that Sonia could remember was that she ran with her 2 children because her husband and her older children had already died. And she hid in a chicken coop. And she saw how her father and mother were put inside of the small cottages that they had there and were burned alive. And she ran to the mountains, and that was the only place that she could feel safe. And 3 days later, after all the massacre had finished, people came back and tried to bury their dead. But one of the things that Sonia was struggling with is that she could only find her husband. She couldn't find her 2 older children. And she looked and looked and looked. And a week after, people that had survived, they're like, Sonia, we have found her 2 children. They're on the crossroads of a little road that comes up to our communities. And they are being displayed as a warning to never conspire against the Guatemalan government. Who could hear Sonia? Sonia didn't even speak Spanish. She only spoke her language, her native language, Quiche. What Sonia didn't know, that in the same mountain range, there was another woman who did not speak Spanish, who had only gotten probably 3rd grade education, but she said, this is enough. And she started to speak out. And in the early 1980s, she spoke out, she rallied against the government and had to go to Mexico. This was Rigoberta. And there in Mexico, she found a journalist from South America. Since she couldn't really write or speak that well, she narrated her whole story. And that journalist from South America published a book. And the whole world finally found out about the genocide being perpetrated against the Guatemalan indigenous people. Rigoberta Menchú got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992 for her work to bring light to such genocide. But the question is there any hope that we can find in the Bible? Is there any lesson that we can provide to people that have seen war or that have experienced war, that they can find solace in the Word of God? Today, we are going to be talking about a woman that I can say she was forgotten. She was completely forgotten in the Bible, or I can say maybe even overlooked. The reality is that the woman that we're going to be talking about today, she never said a word, and her story may fall through the cracks of stories that we might say are way more important in the book of 2 Samuel. But her story really brings hope for those people like Sonia that maybe have not had the best of lives on this earth. To understand the story of Rizpah, we have to go way, way back to when the Israelites started conquering the land. The Israelites were brought out of Egypt. They were guided by Moses, and they were right there in Canaan when God said, "Go and conquer the land." But the Israelites were like, I don't know, they're too big, we can't go. They rebelled, and only Joshua and Caleb were the ones that were brave enough to say, "No, God is with us, we can go and conquer." And because of that, the Lord said, "You are going to be wandering through the desert for the next 40 years. So Moses had passed away. Joshua was now the leader of the Israelites, and this time the Israelites were not going to mess up. They were confident, they know that God was going to be with them. They conquered Jericho, and slowly but surely they started to conquer all the nations around them. Now, God had instructed the Israelites very clearly, "You are to conquer everybody around Jericho. I am going to be with you." And as the nation saw that the Israelites started advancing and they saw what the God of the Israelites was able to do, the nations around them started to get worried. And one of the nations that was extremely worried was the Gibeonites. Now, the Gibeonites came up with a plan to be able at least to survive, Israel as they moved on to conquer the rest of the nations. And they came up with what I think is a very brilliant plan. Though the Gibeonites were very, very close to the Israelites, and they were within the territory that God had told the Israelites to conquer, they decided to outsmart them. And what they did is that, even though they were very close, they dressed in old clothes, they got moldy bread, they got where you store wine that was very old, that was all patched up. And then they came up to Joshua and said, "Joshua, we come from far, far away, and we have heard what the God of Israel had done for the Israelites. And what we want to do is that, because we're so far away, and likely you will never get so close to conquer, but we just want to make sure that we have peace with you." Now, when Joshua heard them, he did not really believe them. The Bible says, Joshua questioned them, where are you coming from? But they showed him, Joshua, when we started this journey, this bread was fresh. Our sandals weren't patched up, but we come from so far away that our bread is now moldy. So after inspectioning them, it says in Joshua chapter 9, verse 14, if you want to go there with me, it said, "The Israelites sampled the provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. So they decided to make a decision without inquiring of the Lord. And then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified the oath. And once an oath had been ratified by the assembly, it could not be broken." 3 days later, after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were their neighbors, living near them. So the Israelites set out on the third day and came to the cities of Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, Kiriath, Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole assembly grumbled against the leaders, but all the leaders answered, "We have given them our oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now." Even if they wanted to, even if they were, God had clearly stated there was an oath made with the assembly, and this oath was not only to be kept while they were conquering the land. You cannot touch the Gibeonites from now until how long the nation of Israel was around. So that was a clear oath that had been made with the Gibeonites. So the second part of the story, where we're meeting Rizpah, happens hundreds of years later. The Israelites conquer the land, Joshua dies, then we have Judges. The Israelites decide that they want to be like the other nations around them, and they didn't want to be a judge. They don't want to be they don't want to be a theocracy anymore, that God is their king. They want to have a king that they can see like the other nations. So Samuel is very sad, but God says, "Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. It's okay. If they want a king, go ahead. Give them a king." So here we appear with Saul. Now, this part of the story is not specifically narrated in the Bible, but it is inferred in later chapters. And what appears to be is that Saul was so zealous for God that he decided to go and conquer all those small nations around the Israelites that have been giving them trouble. And one of those nations were the Gibeonites. Now, we just learned that there was an oath that had been made between the Gibeonites, Joshua, and the assembly that could not be broken. So Saul did not have the right to go and attack the Gibeonites. However, he did. Now, Saul's ending wasn't great. He was astray from the path of the Lord, and then he died later on the hands of the Philistines. Now, something interesting that happened, and sometimes we forget in the story of Israel, is though David had been anointed king by Samuel, David did not go and lead the people of Israel right away. Actually, after Saul died, one of his sons was anointed by the captain of Saul, known as Abner, and there he reigned over most of Israel for 7 years. Well, for 2 years, actually. And what happened was that Judah, the tribe of David, went up to Hebron, anointing him king, and David reigned over them for 7 years. Now, there was always a big war between the house of David and the house of Saul, because now we have Israel with two different kings. And though most of Israel had recognized that David was the anointed king, David was being patient to be able to take over the land. And Abner, who was the captain of Saul, who had survived the war where Saul had died, he had been doing everything possible to ensure that Saul, the house of Saul, continued to be the king of Israel. So he goes and puts Ishbosheth, which is one of the sons of Saul, to be king. And I don't know what Abner's intentions were, but it appears that Abner was not only keeping the kingdom because he loved Saul, but it also appeared that for Abner there was some power play that he wanted to do to eventually take over the throne. And if we go to 2 Samuel chapter 3, we see that finally Abner gets sick of the house of Saul and decides that he is going to go over to David's side. But what is it that triggers Abner to go and finally accept that David is the rightful king? Well, it says in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 6, during the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Abner was very angry because of what he had implied. So he answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David. Yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman. May God deal with Abner, be ever so severely, if I do not for David what the Lord promised him on oath." And that was that. Now Abner has gone to the side of David. But this is the first time that we ever hear about the woman, the forgotten woman that I had mentioned at the beginning. Her name was Rizpah. She was the daughter of Abigail, and she technically wasn't a wife of Saul. She was simply a concubine. It is thought about some theologians that what Abner was doing was trying to, by sleeping with one of Saul's concubines, trying to assert his dominance over the throne. And that's why the son of Saul was so worried about Abner taking her as a wife. Now, we don't know if this was consensual or not, but what we start to see is that Rizpah is simply a pawn in the story. Likely, she was a woman in the time of Israel. She didn't have a choice. If her dad decided to give her to Saul, that was it. She was now his wife. And after Saul has died, she has nowhere to go. So she goes with one of her stepsons, and there she is used as a pawn again by one of the generals to assert his power over the throne. Now, Abner goes to the side of David, and a lot of things happen. David is finally the king of Israel, and we see that there is a civil war in Israel, and a few years later, the story, or Rizpah, appears back in the story of Israel. And we're going to find it a few chapters later, actually in 2 Samuel chapter 21. And this is where the real story of Rizpah starts or shines. It says that starting on verse 1, chapter 21, 2 Samuel, it says, "During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, 'It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death.'" So what we're experiencing here is that there is a famine in the land for 3 years. There has been no crops. And when David goes back and inquires from the Lord, why we are in a famine? And the Lord says, "I haven't forgotten what Saul did. I remember the oath that Joshua and the assembly did with the Gibeonites, and it was that they should not be touched. And Saul, during his reign, decided to go and kill the Gibeonites, and now this is the penance that Israel must pay." On verse 2 said, "The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul and his zeal for Israel and Judah had tried to annihilate them. David asked the Gibeonites, 'What shall I do? How should I make atonement for what you will, so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?' The Gibeonites answered him, 'We have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death.' 'What do you want me to do for you?' David asked. They answered the king, 'As for the man who destroyed us and plotted against us, so that we have been disseminated and have no place anywhere in Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed, and their bodies exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one.' So the king said, 'I will give them to you. If this is what we need to do in order to stop the famine, because we have broken an oath, then you can go ahead and take the 7 men who are descendants of Saul.'" Verse 7, "The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. But the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the son of Aiah's daughter Rizpah. Here we see Rizpah again. Her 2 sons were chosen to be put to death, whom she had borne to Saul, together with 5 sons of Saul's daughter Merab, whom she had borne to Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Mahalohite. He handed them over to the Gibeonites, who killed them and exposed their bodies on the hill before the Lord. All 7 of them fell together. They were put to death during the first days of the harvest, just as the barley harvest was beginning. And here is where Rizpah's story starts to shine. Now, Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it out for herself on a rock. From the beginning of the harvest till the rain poured down from the heavens on the bodies, she did not let the birds touch them by day or the wild animals by night. When David was told what Aiah's daughter Rizpah, Saul's concubine, had done, he went and took the bones of Saul and the sons of Jonathan from the citizens of Jabesh Gilead. They had stolen their bodies from the public square at the Beth-shan, where the Philistines had hung them after they struck Saul down in Gilboa. David brought the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan from there, and the bones of those who had been killed and exposed were gathered up. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father Kish at Selah and Benjamin, and did everything the king commanded. After that, God answered prayer in behalf of the land. And that is the story of Rizpah, a woman who had been simply a pawn, who had absolutely no power. Because of her, God answered the prayer on behalf of the land and cured the famine. But what can we learn from this very disturbing, terrible, sad story of Rizpah? One of the things, there are 3 main things that we can learn. And one of the main things that, stands out to me is the fact of injustice. Rizpah was a pawn. She didn't have a choice. She never did. She was a pilgesh. That's the word for concubine in Hebrew. And though a lot of us translate it to concubine, and it said that most of the concubines had almost the same rights of a wife, pilgesh, in its most basic translation, it means a woman that is owned by a powerful man for his pleasure. That's what Rizpah was. That's what Rizpah was for Saul. That's what Rizpah was for Abner. And she had absolutely no power to go and talk to the king. But what can we learn from her story? The reality is that maybe like us here in church, we have the privilege of never having to experience what Rizpah had to experience. We don't know, we can't relate to her story. But the reality is that a lot of people in our community, a lot of people out there in the world can relate to Rizpah. A lot of times when we open the Bible, even when we share the word, we like to talk about the stories of Moses, the story of Esther, the story of Deborah, the story of Elijah. And though we do highlight the defects that these people did have, a lot of the people around the world in our community cannot relate to any of them. But what they can relate to is the story of Rizpah. It is comforting to be able to open the Bible and see that somebody there in the Bible was able to experience or went to similar experiences like they did. It is comforting to see that although they seemed that they had been forgotten, God left in the Bible, in 2 Samuel, even though it's kind of hidden in there, the story of a woman that suffered as much as maybe Sonia did in those early days of Guatemala, or as somebody is suffering right now during the war. It means that it's comforting that to think that the God of Israel knows, I know there's so much injustice in the world, but I see you. I don't forget about you. You are not forgotten. The stories that you are experiencing now have been experienced from somebody else in the Bible, and though they didn't have to be recorded, I think God in his ever wisdom and an everlasting love left the story of Rizpah for those people who have gotten through traumatic experiences to find somebody in the Bible they can relate to. It seems that God is saying to us, I see the injustice. I see you. You have not been forgotten. But the story of Rizpah is not only the story that highlights injustice. The story of Rizpah is also a story of hope and redemption. Rizpah had no power. She could not go and intervene to the king. Obviously, she couldn't. She couldn't go and ask the king, please spare the life of my 2 children. She couldn't go up to the assembly. She didn't have a lawyer. And for most of the part of the story, it seemed that everybody had forgotten about Rizpah. It seems that even God had forgotten about Rizpah. It started by being given to a man. She was used upon by his general. And then life gives her the ultimate blow when she's like, well, my husband died. He's not the king anymore. The kingdom has been taken from his house, but at least I have my 2 sons. But life comes back and says to Rizpah, no, you don't. Now the Gibeonites are asking for retribution, and those only 2 sons that you have alive that you probably can relate to, that are probably the people that are, providing subsistence to Rizpah, because Rizpah was a widow, and in Israel, the widows, it's care for the widow, because if you don't have a husband that's alive, if you don't have a brother, if you don't have a son to take care of you, you're all on your own. And her only hope to have a house, to have food, is taken away from her, from David, the same man who took over the kingdom of her husband. And now they are sacrificed and displayed. Rizpah really has no power. But one of the things that I do admire about Rizpah is that even though she apparently had no power and she could have gone home like Merab and just mourned her sons, she does something very interesting. She goes on a rock, she spreads the cloth and sack and ashes, and then she mourns the death of her 2 sons and of the other 5 men there. And not only does she mourn, she stays there, and the wild animals, the scavengers, she stays there. Nothing deters her. And what we have to understand is that Rizpah saw those bodies stiffen. They saw those bodies soften. They saw those bodies being, blown because of putrefaction. And she had to sit there and be able to sustain the putrid smell that those bodies were giving out. And still, she did not give up. I can't do anything. I can't go to the king. I couldn't save my children. But one thing I can do is that I can sit here quietly and make the king know and make the world face what has happened to my family. And it seems that she is all alone. It doesn't seem that anybody from Israel came and said, Rizpah, can I help you? I will mourn with you. Like, is there food that you can give, that I can give you? Is there anything I can do to go and talk to the king? Nobody did that. Why did Rizpah stay there and was so sure that she was going to be heard? And I'd like to think is that it's Rizpah's faith. She's like, if nobody else will hear me, I still believe in the God of Israel who cares for the woman, who cares for the widow, and I don't know how he's going to do it, but the only justice that I can still achieve, he will hear me. And God was there. God had not forgotten Rizpah, because even though the Gibeonites had asked for retribution, those bodies were up there displayed, and God still did not send the rain. He's like, yes, retribution has been paid, but there's still some injustice that has to be rectified. And it's not until David actually hears the story of Rizpah and goes and takes the bones of Saul and brings down the bones that God restores the land. God is saying right there, Rizpah, you might think that you're forgotten. You might think that none of the Israelites care. You might think that the king, the anointed king of God, is not with you. But me, Rizpah, the Lord of Israel, is standing by your side. And it's not until they take care and provide justice for you am I going to heal the land. That is the story of hope and redemption that we can see by Rizpah. God provided to her at the end the only justice that she could ask for, and it was the appropriate burial of her sons. But the last lesson that Rizpah gives us is a lesson to us as a community, as a church. Many times we are called, and it's easy to be called to provide food, to provide shelter, but it's sometimes very hard for us as a community to be able to abide in uncomfortable silence with those people who have suffered traumatic experiences like Rizpah. Sometimes the only thing that we can provide is the ministry of presence as a community, as a church. When there is no easy fixes, when there's no easy answers, there is nothing that we can do but provide the ministry of presence to those people that most need it. Nobody did that for Rizpah. The community of Israel didn't provide that for her. But as a community, as a church, God does call us to say, please do not forget the people who have suffered. I know you can't fix it. The injustices of the world will always be there. But you are called to provide a source of comfort for those people who most need it. May we always remember to provide the ministry of presence to those around us, and that we always be the hand of God to provide comfort for those who most need it. May God bless you now and always.